The cathedral bells of Vienna rang through the winter morning as Lady Georgiana Vane stood frozen in her ivory silk gown, watching the man she had loved in secret since childhood raise a gloved hand to her throat. Arthur, Duke of Stirling, his emerald royal regency coat catching the light from the stained glass windows, did not reach for her cameo brooch, he reached for her veil. "Burn it," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chapel like shattered glass. "This marriage is not a union. It is the vow I made over my father's grave to destroy yours." The Viennese court gasped. 300 nobles, dressed in their winter finery, watched as the Duke's personal attendant stepped forward with a silver candelabra. Georgiana's hands trembled against the lace of her veil. The swan cameo at her throat, her mother's final gift before death, suddenly felt like a noose tightening with every breath. Arthur's dark eyes held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he had won. He leaned close enough that only she could hear his next words. "Your father destroyed mine, ruined him, watched him die in disgrace without lifting a finger." His breath was hot against her ear. "Now I will destroy everything the Vane name touches, starting with you. Stay until the end, because this story will show you how love can shatter even the most unbreakable walls of revenge." Georgiana had known the Duke since they were children at the imperial court. She remembered him as a boy of 15, serious and kind, who once helped her retrieve a fallen ribbon during the Emperor's winter ball. She had been 12, mortified at her clumsiness, and he had smiled at her with such gentleness that she had carried the memory like a secret treasure for 11 years. Then his father, the old Duke of Stirling, died in disgrace, accused of embezzling imperial funds through falsified treasury documents. The family fortune was seized by the crown. The Stirling estates were auctioned to pay fabricated debts. Arthur disappeared for 7 years, only to return at 28, harder, wealthier from mysterious ventures in the East, and burning with a singular purpose, to reclaim what was lost. He blamed her father. Lord Frederick Vane, the late imperial treasurer, had signed the documents. Lord Frederick had testified before Emperor Franz himself. Lord Frederick had watched the Stirling estate crumble without lifting a finger to help, even as Arthur's mother wasted away from grief, and his younger sister was forced into a convent for lack of a dowry. What Arthur didn't know was that Lord Frederick had died 3 months ago, broken and haunted, whispering apologies Georgiana didn't understand. In his final hours at their country estate in Lower Austria, he had clutched her hand with skeletal fingers and begged forgiveness for sins he wouldn't name. "The seal," he had gasped, his eyes wild with fever. "Find the seal with the raven and stars. It will prove—" But death had stolen the rest. And what Georgiana didn't know was that her father had been forced to lie under threat of her life, that when she was a child of 7, masked men had held a blade to her sleeping throat while her father watched, paralyzed, that he had been given a choice: sign the false testimony or watch his daughter's blood stain her nursery floor. A child's life bargained against a man's honor. He had chosen her life, and it had destroyed him anyway, slowly from the inside. The marriage contract had been signed 2 weeks ago in the Emperor's presence at Schönbrunn Palace. Arthur's expression never changed as he wrote his name in the imperial registry, his penmanship as cold and precise as a death warrant. Georgiana wore the swan cameo brooch her mother had given her the morning she died of scarlet fever, a piece that had been in the Vane family for 4 generations. It depicted a pair of swans, their necks entwined in eternal devotion, surrounded by delicate edelweiss flowers. The Dowager Duchess Augusta Stirling watched from the shadows of the palace's mirror gallery, a slight smile on her thin, powdered lips. She had orchestrated this marriage through careful whispers to the emperor's closest advisers, through late-night meetings in hidden drawing rooms and subtle manipulations of the Imperial Marriage Bureau. Let the boy think it was his idea. Let him believe he was the architect of his own revenge. But Augusta had other plans, plans that required both of them broken, both of them desperate, both of them too consumed by their personal war to notice what she was really after: the restoration of her personal seal to the imperial archives, the seal with the raven over 3 stars. The wedding ceremony itself was an exquisite torture. Georgiana stood at the altar in St. Stephen's Cathedral, beneath soaring Gothic arches that had witnessed 7 centuries of imperial weddings. Winter light streamed through stained glass windows, painting her ivory silk gown in shades of sapphire and ruby. She spoke her vows in a voice that didn't shake, though inside she was breaking into pieces too small to ever reassemble. Arthur's voice was cold and measured, each word a calculated blade. "I take you, Georgiana Elizabeth Vane, not as my beloved, but as the payment owed to my family's honor." The priest faltered. The emperor's representative, Count von Metternich, shifted uncomfortably in the front pew, but no one stopped the ceremony. No one dared. When the priest declared them married, Arthur kissed her cheek with all the warmth of a business transaction closing. His lips were cold. His hand on her waist was a brand of ownership, not affection. Then he stepped back, gestured to his attendant, and commanded the burning of her veil before 300 witnesses. The lace caught fire quickly. Georgiana watched the flames consume the Brussels lace that had taken artisans 6 months to create, the delicate pattern of roses and nightingales turning to ash. She would not cry. She would not give him that. The wedding breakfast was held at the Hofburg Palace, a grand affair with the cream of Viennese society in attendance. Georgiana sat beside her new husband at the head table, beneath crystal chandeliers that glittered like frozen tears, and smiled until her face ached. Arthur barely looked at her. When he did speak, it was only to make cutting remarks disguised as courtesy. "My wife is very accomplished at maintaining appearances," he said to the Marquis of Salzburg, loud enough for half the table to hear. "A skill her father taught her well, I imagine, the art of the beautiful lie." Georgiana set down her wine-glass with careful precision. The Bohemian crystal caught the light. She would not give him the satisfaction of tears. She would not break in public. If he wanted to humiliate her, she would meet it with the same dignity her mother had shown facing death. The wedding night was silent and separate. Arthur had arranged chambers in opposite wings of his newly reclaimed Vienna residence, a grand Baroque mansion overlooking the Ringstrasse. The rooms assigned to Georgiana were beautiful in their emptiness. Walls covered in jade silk damask, furniture inlaid with mother-of-pearl, a canopy bed hung with velvet curtains the color of winter twilight. No servants came to help her undress. No fire had been lit in the marble hearth. The rooms were as cold as a mausoleum. She managed the buttons and laces herself, her fingers numb with cold and something worse than cold. She wrapped herself in her traveling cloak, still smelling of the coach journey from Schönbrunn, and sat by the window. Below, Vienna glittered with gaslight and snow. She watched the flakes begin to fall, each one a small, perfect death, and wondered how her life had come to this frozen moment. In his own chambers, 3 floors above and a world away, Arthur stood at his desk, staring at a document he had kept locked in a mahogany box for 7 years. It was the ledger page his father had supposedly signed, authorizing the false contracts that had brought down the sterling name and fortune. Even now, looking at it by candlelight, something felt wrong. The signature was too careful, too controlled, each letter perfectly formed. His father's hand had been bold, almost reckless, the handwriting of a man who lived with absolute confidence. This looked practiced, forged. But revenge had consumed Arthur for so long that doubt felt like betrayal. He poured himself brandy from a crystal decanter, the amber liquid catching the firelight, and tried not to think about the way Georgiana had looked at him when she spoke her vows, as if she could see straight through to the boy he used to be. The boy who had helped a clumsy girl retrieve a ribbon and received her smile like a benediction. He drained the glass and poured another. Morning came cold and grey, the sky the color of ash. Georgiana woke stiff and aching in the chair by the window, her neck cramped from sleeping upright. A maid finally appeared, a young woman named Greta with kind eyes and a Salzburg accent, who looked at the new Duchess with undisguised pity. "His Grace requests that you join him for breakfast in the conservatory, my lady," Greta said quietly, already moving to stoke the fire that should have been lit the night before. "He said to tell you that punctuality is a virtue he values highly." Georgiana looked at the snow still falling beyond the window, at the city that was now her prison, at the wedding ring on her finger that felt like iron shackles. "Tell His Grace," she said, her voice steady as winter stone, "that I will join him shortly, and that punctuality is indeed a virtue, as is mercy. Perhaps one day he will learn to value both." Greta's eyes widened slightly. Then the smallest smile touched her lips as she curtsied and left to deliver the message. Georgiana rose from the chair, her body protesting every movement. She would dress. She would face him. She would survive this marriage. And somehow, in the ruins of her father's reputation and her own shattered heart, she would find the truth her father had died trying to tell her. The seal with the raven and 3 stars was waiting to be found, and when she found it, everything would change. Georgiana descended the marble staircase in a gown of midnight blue silk, her fingers trailing along the banister of polished mahogany. The Duke's residence was a monument to reclaimed glory, every chandelier dripping with crystal, every wall hung with paintings rescued from auction houses across Europe. Arthur had rebuilt his family's fortune with methodical precision, and now he displayed it like armor. The conservatory waited at the end of a long gallery lined with portraits of sterling ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, judging, accusing. She lifted her chin and kept walking. Arthur sat at a small table surrounded by exotic ferns and orchids, the morning light filtered through glass panes streaked with frost. He didn't rise when she entered, didn't even look up from the newspaper he was reading, the Wiener Zeitung rustling in his hands like a declaration of disinterest. "You're late," he said. "By 3 minutes." Georgiana took the seat across from him without waiting for invitation. "Hardly a mortal sin." "In my house, punctuality is not negotiable." He turned a page. "Your maid should have informed you of my expectations." Greta was very thorough. Georgiana reached for the silver coffee pot, her movements deliberately calm. "She also mentioned that fires are only lit in occupied rooms. I assume my chambers were deemed unoccupied?" "They were empty." Arthur finally lowered the paper, his dark eyes meeting hers with calculated coldness. "They will remain." The coffee was bitter on her tongue, but she drank it without flinching. Around them, the conservatory bloomed with impossible life. Jasmine from the Orient, roses from Persia, orchids from places she couldn't name. All of it thriving in this glass cage, while she froze. "I've arranged your schedule," Arthur continued, producing a folded piece of paper from his waistcoat. "You will take breakfast at 7. You will receive callers on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 2 and 4. You will attend social functions as required for the sake of appearances. You will not enter my study, my private chambers, or the East Wing without explicit permission." She set down her cup. "Am I to understand I'm a prisoner in my own home?" "This is not your home. It is mine." He slid the paper across the table. "And you are not a prisoner. You are a wife performing her contractual obligations. There is a difference." She looked at the schedule without touching it. Every hour accounted for, every movement prescribed, a life reduced to ink on paper, as cold and lifeless as a ledger entry. "What about the library?" she asked. Arthur paused. "What about it?"
Is it in the forbidden East Wing, or am I permitted to read?" Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or annoyance that she would dare ask for anything. "The library is acceptable, though I hardly think novels will fill your days adequately." "I don't read novels." Georgiana finally picked up the schedule, scanning the cramped handwriting. "I prefer history, philosophy. My father taught me to read Latin when I was 10. "Your father?" Arthur's voice turned to ice. "Yes, I'm sure he taught you many useful skills. Deception, manipulation, the art of looking innocent while guilty men prosper." Georgiana's hand tightened on the paper, crumpling one corner. She forced herself to breathe, to hold his gaze without flinching. "My father is dead, Your Grace. Whatever sins you believe he committed died with him, unless you plan to dig up his grave and demand satisfaction from his bones." Arthur stood so abruptly, his chair scraped against the tile. For a moment she thought he might strike her. Instead, he walked to the glass wall, his back rigid, his hands clasped behind him like a general surveying a battlefield. "Your father destroyed mine while breathing," he said quietly. "I see no reason his death should absolve him of punishment. You carry his name, his blood, that will have to suffice." The cruelty of it stole her breath. Georgiana rose slowly, carefully, the schedule still clutched in her hand. "Then I am to be punished for being born?" "You are to be reminded daily of what your family cost mine." Arthur turned, and the morning light behind him made him a dark silhouette, faceless and implacable. "Consider these rooms your gilded cell, Lady Georgiana. You may move within them, you may pretend at civility, but you will never forget that you are here as a payment for a debt your father could not settle in life." Georgiana walked to the door, each step measured, refusing to flee though every instinct screamed for escape. At the threshold she paused. "My mother used to say that revenge is a poison that kills the one who drinks it. I hope for both our sakes that you have a strong constitution, Your Grace, because you seem determined to drain the cup." She left before he could respond, walking back through that gallery of judging ancestors, past the glittering chandeliers and rescued paintings, up the marble staircase to her beautiful, empty, freezing rooms. Greta was there, laying out fresh linens, and looked up with worried eyes. "My lady, shall I—" "Light the fire, please," Georgiana said, her voice finally breaking, "and bring me every book on imperial treasury law from the library. If I'm to be imprisoned here, I might as well understand the bars of my cage." The Hofburg Palace glittered like a jewel box that evening, every window blazing with candlelight, every corridor filled with the rustle of silk and the murmur of Vienna's most influential families. Georgiana stood at Arthur's side in the receiving line, her gown of emerald green chosen specifically to match his Regency coat, a united front, a beautiful lie. "The Duke and Duchess of Stirling," the herald announced, and heads turned throughout the imperial ballroom. Whispers followed them like shadows. The marriage was only a week old, but already the gossip had spread. The cold ceremony, the burned veil, the separate wings of their mansion. Vienna fed on scandal, and they had provided a feast. Arthur's hand rested at the small of her back, but there was no warmth in the touch. It was a brand of ownership, a public claim that made her skin crawl beneath the layers of silk and boning. She kept her smile fixed, her posture perfect, even as Emperor Franz himself approached with his retinue of advisers. "Sterling," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the throne. "Duchess, how lovely to see you both looking so united." The pause before that final word was deliberate. Georgiana curtsied low, her skirts pooling around her like water. "Your Majesty honors us with his presence." "Indeed." The Emperor's eyes, sharp despite his years, moved between them. "I trust the marriage I arranged is proving satisfactory." Arthur's hand pressed harder against her spine. "Entirely satisfactory, Your Majesty. My wife understands her position perfectly." "Her position," the Count von Metternich interjected smoothly, appearing at the Emperor's elbow like a well-dressed spectre, "as the Duchess of Stirling carries considerable social responsibility. I do hope, Your Grace, that you're settling into your new role with grace." "I endeavor to meet all expectations," Georgiana replied, meeting the Count's probing gaze without flinching, "though I confess I'm still learning which expectations are reasonable." Arthur's jaw tightened. She felt it in the tension radiating through his hand. But before he could respond, the Emperor chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. Spoken like a true diplomat's daughter, "Your father would be proud." The words hung in the air like smoke. Arthur's fingers dug into her back hard enough to bruise. "Her father," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearest, "was many things. Proud, certainly. Honest?" He paused, letting silence do the work of accusation. "That remains a matter of some debate." The conversations around them stuttered and stopped. Georgiana felt the weight of 100 eyes turned toward them, hungry for blood. The Emperor's expression hardened.
"Sterling," von Metternich said quietly, a warning wrapped in silk. But Arthur had already released her, stepping forward to address the gathering crowd. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but I believe in transparency. My wife carries the name of Lord Frederick Vane, the man whose testimony destroyed my father and our family fortune. I married her, yes, at your imperial decree, but I will not pretend the past never happened. I will not smile and play the devoted husband while my father's grave remains dishonored." Georgiana felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This was worse than a private cruelty. This was a public execution, performed before the entire Viennese court. She could flee, she could weep, she could collapse and give them all exactly the spectacle they craved. Instead, she stepped forward, her chin raised, her voice clear and steady. "Your Majesty, my lords and ladies, my husband speaks from a wound I cannot heal. He lost his father to disgrace and grief. I understand his pain, because I too lost my father. I watched him waste away, consumed by secrets he would not share, begging forgiveness for sins I did not understand." She turned to Arthur, meeting his shocked gaze directly. "If my father wronged yours, I am sorry. If he was complicit in evil, I condemn it. But I will not apologize for being born. I will not beg forgiveness for blood I did not choose. And I will not be humiliated in silence while my husband seeks vengeance against a ghost." The ballroom had gone absolutely still. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Arthur stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, something unnamed flickering behind the cold fury in his eyes. "You dare?" he began. "I dare to speak truth," Georgiana interrupted, her voice trembling now but unbowed. "You wanted a wife who would break under your cruelty, who would weep and beg and give you the satisfaction of complete victory. But I am not that woman, Your Grace. My father may have failed you, but I will not fail myself." She curtsied to the Emperor, deep and perfect, then turned and walked through the parted crowd. Every eye followed her, every whisper tracked her path, but she kept moving, kept breathing, until she reached the terrace doors and stepped out into the winter night.
The cold air hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it. Behind her she heard Arthur's voice making an excuse, heard the Emperor's sharp reply, heard the crowd begin to buzz with renewed energy. Let them talk, let them feast on this scandal for weeks. She had survived, and more than that, she had seen doubt flicker in Arthur's eyes. Just for a moment, he had looked at her not as the daughter of her enemy, but as a woman standing alone against the world. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in his armor. And cracks, Georgiana knew, were where light got in.
The letter arrived 3 days after the Hofburg reception, slipped beneath Georgiana's door while she slept. Greta found it in the morning, a cream-colored envelope sealed with plain wax, bearing no crest or mark, just her name written in careful, anonymous script. Georgiana broke the seal at her dressing table while Greta brushed out her hair. The message inside was brief, almost cryptic. If you seek the truth about your father's testimony, come to the Imperial Archives Reading Room, Tuesday, 2 o'clock. Ask for the Aldrich Estate Records, 1818. Come alone, a friend to justice. She read it 3 times, her hands trembling. It could be a trap, Arthur testing her loyalty, baiting her into some confession of conspiracy. Or worse, someone seeking to exploit her isolation, her desperation for answers about her father's dying words. But the seal with the raven and 3 stars haunted her dreams. Her father's final gasping plea echoed in her memory. Find the seal. It will prove. Prove what? His innocence? His guilt? She had to know. Tuesday came cold and bright. Georgiana told Greta she was visiting the lending library on Coalmarkt, a respectable outing for a duchess. She wore a simple walking dress of charcoal wool, her plainest cloak, and took a hired cab rather than the Sterling carriage. Arthur was at his club, discussing investments with men who pretended not to remember when his family had nothing. He wouldn't miss her. The Imperial Archives occupied a wing of the old palace, all vaulted ceilings and endless rows of shelves stretching into shadow. Georgiana approached the desk where an elderly clerk sat hunched over a massive ledger, his spectacles sliding down his nose. "I'm looking for the Aldrich Estate Records," she said quietly, "from 1818. The clerk didn't look up. "Reading room 3, Mr. Thorne is expecting you." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She followed his pointing finger down a corridor lined with portraits of dead emperors, their painted eyes following her progress. Reading room 3 was small and windowless, lit by a single oil lamp. A man stood with his back to her, studying a shelf of leather-bound volumes. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He turned, and she saw a man perhaps 50 years old, thin and scholarly, with ink stains on his fingers and the cautious eyes of someone who had seen too many secrets. "Duchess Sterling, thank you for coming. I know this required considerable courage." "Who are you?" "I was the junior archivist when your father testified before the Emperor." Thorne pulled a volume from the shelf, setting it on the reading table with reverence. "I was there when he signed the documents condemning Duke Aldrich, and I was there when he wept afterwards, alone in this very room, believing no one could see him." Georgiana's breath caught. My father wept? Like a man whose soul had been torn from his body. Thorne opened the volume, revealing page after page of official testimony, stamped with imperial seals. I didn't understand then. I was young, ambitious, concerned only with proper filing and procedure. But years later, I began to notice inconsistencies, documents that appeared in the archives without proper chain of custody, seals that looked authentic but felt wrong when you knew what to look for. He turned to a specific page, his finger tracing a wax seal at the bottom.
This is the document your father supposedly signed of his own free will, the confession that Duke Aldrich had embezzled imperial funds through fraudulent contracts. Georgiana leaned closer, studying her father's signature. It looked right, the bold flourish, the confident strokes, but something in the spacing felt off, as if he'd been interrupted while writing.
"I don't understand. What are you trying to tell me?" Thorn reached into his coat and withdrew a smaller envelope, yellowed with age. 6 months ago, a deathbed confession reached me through channels I cannot reveal. A former mercenary, dying of lung fever, unburdening his soul. He confessed to being part of a group hired to persuade your father to testify. Persuade? The word felt hollow. They held a blade to your throat while you slept. You were 7 years old. Your father was given a choice: sign the false testimony or watch you die. Thorn's voice cracked. He chose your life, and it destroyed him. The room tilted. Georgiana gripped the edge of the table, her vision blurring. 7 years old. She remembered that year, remembered her father becoming distant, haunted, remembered him watching her at breakfast as if memorizing her face. She'd thought he was mourning her mother, who had died the year before, but he'd been mourning something else entirely. His honor, his truth. Why didn't he tell anyone afterward? Why didn't he recant? Because they threatened to come back, to finish what they'd started if he ever spoke. Thorn closed the volume gently. And because by then Duke Aldrich was already dead. The damage was done. Your father convinced himself that silence was the only way to keep you safe. Who hired them? Georgiana's voice was raw. Who orchestrated this? Thorn hesitated, then reached for another document, this one wrapped in protective cloth. This is a ledger I found misfiled in the private imperial accounts. It shows payments made to a mercenary company in 1818, authorized by... He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a signature at the bottom. Above it, pressed into red wax, was a seal. A raven over 3 stars. "The Dowager Duchess Augusta Sterling," Thorn whispered. "She framed your father to cover her own gambling debts. She used imperial funds to pay her creditors, then blamed Duke Aldrich when the discrepancies were discovered. Your father's testimony was meant to seal the case, make it unquestionable." Georgiana stared at the seal, her father's dying words finally making terrible sense. Arthur doesn't know. Arthur believes what his mother wanted him to believe, that your father destroyed his family out of spite or greed or political ambition. Thorn met her eyes. "You have to tell him, show him this evidence, before his revenge consumes you both." "He won't believe me. He'll think I forged it." "Then make him look himself. Bring him here. Let him see the archives, the ledgers, the patterns I've documented over years." Thorn pressed the wrapped document into her hands. "Your father died protecting you. Don't let his sacrifice be meaningless. Find the truth. Expose it." Georgiana clutched the evidence to her chest, feeling its weight like absolution and condemnation all at once. Her father hadn't been a coward or a liar. He'd been a father who chose his daughter's life over his own honor. And now she had to convince the man who hated her that his mother was the true villain in this tragedy. Georgiana returned to the mansion on Ringstrasse with the wrapped ledger hidden beneath her cloak, her mind racing through possibilities. She would approach Arthur carefully, present the evidence without accusation, let the documents speak for themselves. She would appeal to the boy who had once helped her retrieve a fallen ribbon, the boy who must still exist somewhere beneath the armor of rage. But when she stepped into the entrance hall, she found the Dowager Duchess Augusta waiting in the drawing room like a spider at the center of her web. "Close the door, child," Augusta said without looking up from her embroidery. "We have much to discuss." Georgiana's blood turned to ice. She hadn't seen Arthur's mother since the wedding, had assumed the woman remained at her country estate in Styria. But here she sat, upright and severe in black bombazine, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the papery skin of her face. The embroidery in her lap depicted a hunting scene, hounds tearing into a fallen deer. "Your Grace," Georgiana curtsied, her hand instinctively tightening on the ledger beneath her cloak. "I wasn't aware you were visiting." "I don't visit. This is my home." Augusta set down her needle with precise deliberation. "My son may hold the title, but I still control what matters. Now come here, let me look at what you're hiding." "I'm not hiding anything." "Don't insult me with lies, girl. You reek of the Imperial Archives, old paper and desperation. You went to see Thomas Thorne." Augusta's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Did you really think I wouldn't have eyes watching the reading rooms, that I wouldn't know the moment someone started sniffing around those old records?" Georgiana felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "You've been watching the archives." "For 23 years, ever since I made certain arrangements to protect my family's future." Augusta rose slowly, her movements deliberate, predatory. "What did dear Mr. Thorne give you? Let me guess, a ledger? Some conveniently preserved evidence of my supposed crimes? How terribly predictable." "You framed Duke Aldrich. You stole imperial funds and blamed him when the accounts didn't balance." Georgiana pulled the wrapped ledger from beneath her cloak, holding it like a shield. "You blackmailed my father into giving false testimony, threatened to murder me in my bed." "Threatened?" Augusta laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, child, they did more than threaten. They held the blade against your throat for a full hour while your father watched. I wanted him to understand the weight of his choice, the permanence of it." The casual cruelty of it stole Georgiana's breath. "You monster!" "I am a survivor." Augusta moved closer, her black skirts whispering against the carpet. "My husband was a fool who couldn't manage his own accounts, let alone imperial finances. When his incompetence threatened to expose my private investments, I found what any intelligent woman would do. I found a scapegoat. Your father had access, opportunity, and a daughter I could use as leverage. It was remarkably efficient."
"Arthur will know. I'll show him this ledger. I'll take him to Thorne myself."
"Will you?" Augusta's voice turned to silk.
"And what do you think my son will do when you tell him his mother is a murderer? That everything he suffered, everything he's become, was built on my lies?" She reached out and touched Georgiana's cheek with one cold finger. "He'll break, completely. And then he'll turn that rage on himself. I've watched him sharpen his hatred like a blade for 7 years. If you take away his enemy, if you make him realize he's been destroying an innocent woman for crimes I committed—" She leaned close, her breath smelling of peppermint and decay. "He won't survive it. My son is strong enough for revenge. He's not strong enough for the truth." Georgiana jerked back from her touch. "You orchestrated this marriage. You pushed him to marry me." "Of course I did. I needed you close where I could watch you. Your father died with my secrets on his lips. I saw the reports from his doctor, the fever dreams about seals and ravens. I knew eventually you'd come looking." Augusta returned to her chair, picking up her embroidery with perfect composure. "This marriage serves me perfectly. You're isolated, powerless, married to a man who will never believe you over his own mother. And Arthur's hatred keeps him focused on you instead of asking inconvenient questions about the past. He deserves the truth. He deserves peace, stability, a future unburdened by knowing his mother destroyed everything he loved."
Augusta drew her needle through the fabric, adding another drop of red to the dying deer. You can tell him, of course. Show him that ledger. Watch him crumble. Or you can be silent, let him have his revenge against the convenient ghost of your father, and spare him the knowledge that would destroy him. That's not a choice. It's the only choice that matters. Augusta looked up, her eyes as flat and cold as a serpent's. Love or truth, child? You can't give him both. Georgiana stood frozen, the ledger heavy in her hands, understanding blooming like poison in her chest. Augusta had won before the game even began, every move calculated, every piece positioned. Tell Arthur the truth and shatter him. Stay silent and let him destroy her for crimes she didn't commit. Why tell me this? Why admit everything? Because I want you to understand your cage completely, to know that even your small rebellions, your moments of dignity at the Hofburg, your secret visits to archives, I allowed them. I control every aspect of this game. Augusta returned to her embroidery, dismissing her. Now run along, Duchess. Decide whether you love my son enough to let him hate you forever. Either way, my secrets remain buried. Georgiana left the drawing-room on shaking legs, the ledger clutched to her chest like a talisman that had lost all its power. The truth that was supposed to save them had become a weapon that could destroy them both. And Augusta sat in her chair, embroidering her hunting scene, waiting to see which wound Georgiana would choose to inflict.
The fever came that night like a thief, stealing Georgiana's strength until she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Greta found her shivering in the morning, the ledger still clutched in her hands, her skin burning to the touch. "My lady!" Greta's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Someone fetch the physician now!" Georgiana tried to speak, to say she was fine, that she just needed a moment to think, to decide what to do with the truth that could save or destroy them both. But her tongue felt thick, her thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. The room spun, and then there was nothing but darkness and the sound of running feet. She woke to candlelight and hushed voices. The physician was there, his face grave as he spoke to someone beyond her blurred vision. "The fever is severe, Your Grace. Pneumonia, I suspect. The next few days will be critical." "Do whatever is necessary," Arthur's voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear. "Spare no expense. I shall bleed her again in the morning, apply more poultices, but ultimately it's in God's hands now." Georgiana tried to turn her head, to tell them she didn't need bleeding, that she just needed to breathe, but the effort cost too much. She sank back into fever dreams where her father stood at the foot of her bed, whispering about ravens and stars, while Arthur watched from the shadows with eyes full of anguish. Time became meaningless. Sometimes it was day, sometimes night. Greta spooned broth between her lips. The physician came and went, shaking his head with increasing concern, and through it all there was Arthur. She woke once to find him sitting in the chair beside her bed, still wearing his evening clothes from some social obligation, his cravat loosened and his hair dishevelled. He was holding her hand, his thumb tracing absent circles on her palm. "You can't die," he whispered, and she wasn't sure if he knew she could hear him. "I won't allow it. Do you hear me, Georgiana? You don't have my permission to die." She wanted to laugh at the arrogance of it, but could only manage a weak cough that made him lean forward, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead with surprising gentleness.
"I remember you," he said softly, "from the winter ball. You were so mortified when you dropped that ribbon, your face turned completely scarlet. But when I gave it back to you, you smiled at me like I'd performed some great heroic deed instead of just bending down." His voice cracked. "You had a piece of cake in your hair, did you know that? A tiny bit of marzipan. I didn't tell you because you seemed so worried about appearing perfect." Georgiana's eyes fluttered open, finding his face in the candlelight.
He looked younger somehow, the hard edges of revenge softened by exhaustion and fear. "There you are," he breathed. "Stay with me. Just stay." "The ledger," she managed to whisper. "Your mother. I don't care about ledgers or my mother or anything except you breathing." His hand tightened on hers. "We can hate each other tomorrow if you want. We can fight and wound each other, but tonight, just live, please." She saw tears on his face, this man who had sworn to destroy her, and understood that somewhere beneath the armor of rage, the boy who had helped her still existed, still cared, despite everything he'd built to prevent it. "Arthur," she whispered, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." And he didn't. Through that long night and the ones that followed, through the fevers breaking and the slow return of strength, he stayed. Sometimes reading to her from books she didn't recognize, sometimes just sitting in silence, his hand holding hers like an anchor to the world of the living. When she finally woke clear-headed 4 days later, he was asleep in the chair, his head resting on the edge of her bed, his fingers still intertwined with hers. Georgiana's eyes fluttered open, finding his face in the candlelight. He looked younger somehow, the hard edges of revenge softened by exhaustion and fear. "There you are," he breathed. "Stay with me. Just stay." "The ledger," she managed to whisper. "Your mother. I don't care about ledgers or my mother or anything except you breathing." His hand tightened on hers. "We can hate each other tomorrow if you want. We can fight and wound each other, but tonight, just live, please." She saw tears on his face, this man who had sworn to destroy her, and understood that somewhere beneath the armor of rage, the boy who had helped her still existed, still cared, despite everything he'd built to prevent it. "Arthur," she whispered, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." And he didn't. Through that long night and the ones that followed, through the fevers breaking and the slow return of strength, he stayed. Sometimes reading to her from books she didn't recognize, sometimes just sitting in silence, his hand holding hers like an anchor to the world of the living. When she finally woke clear-headed 4 days later, he was asleep in the chair, his head resting on the edge of her bed, his fingers still intertwined with hers. Georgiana looked at their joined hands and felt her carefully constructed hatred crack like ice beneath spring sun. She had a choice to make, truth or mercy, justice or love. But looking at his sleeping face, exhausted from keeping vigil, she realized the choice had already been made somewhere in the fevered darkness. She loved him. God help her, she loved the man who had vowed to destroy her. And that changed everything.
Georgiana waited 3 more days, gathering her strength and her courage in equal measure. She watched Arthur return to his usual coldness during the day, his walls rebuilding themselves brick by careful brick. But at night, when he thought she was sleeping, he still came to sit by her bedside, his hand finding hers in the darkness. The contradiction was tearing him apart. She could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he looked at her. He had let himself care during her illness, and now he hated himself for the weakness. On the 4th day after the fever broke, she asked Greta to help her dress properly and arrange her hair. She retrieved the ledger from where she'd hidden it beneath her mattress and made her way to Arthur's study, the forbidden territory he'd declared off-limits on her first morning in this house. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door and walked in, the wrapped ledger held against her chest like armor. Arthur looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face before it hardened into familiar coldness. "You're not permitted in here." "I know, but this can't wait any longer." Georgiana closed the door behind her, her heart hammering. "I need you to look at something, and I need you to promise you'll examine it with an open mind." "I promise nothing to you." "Then do it for your father, for the truth you claim to value so highly." She crossed to his desk and set the wrapped ledger down between them. "Before you open this, you need to know something. My father didn't betray yours willingly. He was blackmailed, threatened."
Arthur's face darkened. More lies. They held a blade to my throat while I slept. I was 7 years old. My father was given a choice: sign false testimony against your father, or watch me die. Her voice shook but held firm. He chose my life, and it destroyed him. Convenient story. Do you have any proof, or should I simply take your word? Open the ledger. Arthur stared at her for a long moment, something like hope and terror warring in his eyes. Then he reached for the wrapping, his movements deliberate, and unwrapped the ancient document. Georgiana watched his face as he read the entries: payments to a mercenary company, withdrawals from imperial accounts, dates that aligned perfectly with his father's supposed crimes, and at the bottom of each page, authorizing every transaction. "No!" The word came out strangled. Arthur's finger traced the seal pressed in red wax, a raven over 3 stars. This is my mother's personal seal." "I know."
"Where did you get this?" His voice had gone dangerous and quiet. "The Imperial Archives. There's an archivist named Thomas Thorne who's been documenting inconsistencies for years. He found the mercenary's deathbed confession. He found the payment records. All of it points to—" "My mother!" Arthur stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. "You're telling me my mother framed my father, that she's the one who destroyed our family? She embezzled imperial funds to cover gambling debts. When the accounts didn't balance, she needed someone to blame. Your father was the obvious choice. He had access, authority, but she needed testimony to make it unquestionable." Georgina's throat tightened. "That's where my father came in." Arthur paced to the window, his hands clenched into fists. "Why should I believe you? This could all be forged. You could have paid Thorne to create this elaborate fiction." "I could have, but look at the seal, Arthur. Really look at it. You know your mother's seal. You've seen it 1,000 times on correspondence, on official documents." She moved to stand beside him, pointing to the impression. "The raven's left wing has a slight imperfection where the die was damaged. Your mother had it repaired in 1820, but before that, every seal she made bore that exact flaw." Arthur leaned closer, his breath fogging the window glass. She could see the moment recognition hit. His whole body went rigid, his face draining of color. "God," he whispered, "it's real. This is her seal. She orchestrated our marriage to keep me close, to ensure I couldn't expose her, without destroying you in the process." Georgina's voice broke. "She told me you weren't strong enough to survive the truth, that I had to choose between loving you and telling you what she'd done. My mother admitted this to you. To you." Arthur turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "My mother admitted this to you. 4 days ago, before the fever took me." Georgina met his gaze steadily. "She gambled that I would choose to protect you over seeking justice, that I would let you hate me forever, rather than show you evidence that would shatter everything you believed." Arthur stared at her, and she saw the exact moment his world collapsed. All those years of carefully nurtured rage, the revenge he'd crafted so meticulously, the certainty that sustained him, all of it crumbling like sand. "I destroyed you," he said hoarsely, "humiliated you, burned your veil, froze you in empty rooms, paraded our hatred before the entire court, and all of it was built on my mother's lies. Yes." He sank into his chair, as if his legs could no longer hold him. "What have I done?" Arthur found his mother in the conservatory, precisely where he knew she would be at this hour, surrounded by her exotic orchids, tending them with the same cold precision she applied to everything else in her life. She didn't look up when he entered, her shears snipping dead blooms with methodical efficiency. "I wondered how long it would take," Augusta said calmly. "Did the little Duchess finally work up the courage to show you Thorne's ledger?" Arthur felt something crack inside his chest. Part of him had hoped Georgiana was wrong, that there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. But his mother's casual admission destroyed that last fragile hope. "It's true then, all of it." His voice sounded hollow even to his own ears.
Truth is such a limiting concept. Augusta set down her shears and finally looked at him, her expression utterly serene. I prefer to think of it as necessary adaptation. Your father was bleeding our account dry with his incompetence. Someone had to take action. You framed him. You let him die believing he was a criminal. He was a fool. Fools deserve what they get. She reached for a watering can, her movements unhurried. I saved this family, Arthur. I secured our future when your father's bungling would have destroyed us. The fact that I had to sacrifice him to do it was unfortunate but unavoidable. Arthur moved closer, his hands trembling with barely controlled fury. And Lord Frederick Vane, was destroying him also unavoidable? He had access to the Treasury records. He could have exposed the discrepancies before I finished covering my tracks. Augusta poured water over a purple orchid, watching it pool in the soil. I needed him silenced, permanently and publicly. A confession from the imperial treasurer himself made the whole scandal unquestionable. You threatened to murder his daughter, a 7-year-old child. I did what was necessary. Frederick was weak. He would never have betrayed his honor for money or power. But threaten his child? She smiled slightly. Every parent has a breaking point. I simply found his. Arthur felt bile rise in his throat. You're a monster. I'm a survivor. There's a difference. Augusta set down the watering can and turned to face him fully. You were 12 years old when your father died, Arthur. Do you remember how they looked at us? The whispers, the turned backs, the doors that closed in our faces. I rebuilt our name from ashes. I secured your inheritance. I made you a duke again instead of the penniless son of a disgraced criminal. Built on lies and murder. Built on pragmatism, her voice hardened, and you benefited from it every step of the way. The fortune you used to reclaim our estates, my investments, made with funds I redirected before anyone could trace them. The marriage to Georgiana, my arrangement to keep potential threats contained. Everything you have, everything you are, exists because I had the strength to do what your soft-hearted father could not. Arthur stared at her, this woman who had raised him, who had held him when he wept for his father, who had whispered poison in his ear for 7 years. You wanted me to hate her, to destroy Georgiana.
I wanted you focused on an enemy you could punish without destroying yourself. Augusta's tone turned almost maternal. You needed your revenge, darling. I simply redirected it toward a target that wouldn't cost us everything. The vain girl was perfect, connected to the scandal, vulnerable, powerless to defend herself. You could have your vengeance without ever knowing it was misdirected. She's innocent. Her father was innocent. Innocence is irrelevant. They served their purpose. Augusta reached out to touch his face, but Arthur jerked back. She let her hand fall with a small sigh. You're upset now, I understand, but you'll realize I did this for you, for our family. You'll forgive me because I'm your mother, and because deep down you know I'm right. You're too soft to truly punish me, Arthur. You always have been. I wanted you focused on an enemy you could punish without destroying yourself. Augusta's tone turned almost maternal. You needed your revenge, darling. I simply redirected it toward a target that wouldn't cost us everything. The vain girl was perfect, connected to the scandal, vulnerable, powerless to defend herself. You could have your vengeance without ever knowing it was misdirected. She's innocent. Her father was innocent. Innocence is irrelevant. They served their purpose. Augusta reached out to touch his face, but Arthur jerked back. She let her hand fall with a small sigh. You're upset now, I understand, but you'll realize I did this for you, for our family. You'll forgive me because I'm your mother, and because deep down you know I'm right. You're too soft to truly punish me, Arthur. You always have been.
The certainty in her voice, the absolute conviction that he would choose blood over justice, ignited something in Arthur's chest. All those years he'd spent hardening himself, building walls, becoming someone capable of revenge. She thought she knew him, thought she'd shaped him into exactly what she wanted. "You're wrong," he said quietly. Augusta's smile faltered slightly. "Arthur, I may be soft. I may not have your capacity for ruthless calculation, but I learned one thing very well over the past 7 years. I learned how to destroy the people I love. You taught me that." For the first time, he saw uncertainty flicker across his mother's face. "I'm going to the Emperor tomorrow. I'm bringing Thorne's ledger, the mercenary's confession, every piece of evidence that proves what you did. I'm going to expose you before the entire imperial court." "You wouldn't. I'm your mother." "You were my mother. Now you're just the woman who destroyed 2 families, murdered my father's honor, and turned me into a weapon against an innocent woman." Arthur turned toward the door, his decision made. "Enjoy your orchids, Mother. Where you're going, I doubt they'll let you keep them." He left her standing among her exotic flowers, her face finally cracking to reveal something like fear. Behind him, he heard the crash of a clay pot shattering against the floor, but he didn't look back. He had one more person to face, one more apology that could never be adequate. Georgiana was waiting in his study, still pale from her illness, her hands folded in her lap like a prisoner awaiting sentence. "I'm going to make this right," Arthur said from the doorway. "I don't know how, but I will." She looked up at him with eyes that held no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness. "Some things can't be made right, Arthur. They can only be survived."
The hearing at Schönbrunn Palace took place in the Emperor's private council chamber, a room designed for the delivery of justice rather than the pageantry of court. Georgiana sat beside Arthur in the gallery, their hands carefully not touching, while Emperor Franz presided from his raised chair, Count von Metternich at his right hand. Augusta stood in the center of the room, her black gown severe, her posture defiant. She had not begged, had not wept or pleaded innocence. She simply stood like a queen awaiting judgment from lesser beings. "Mr. Thomas Thorne," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "present your findings." The archivist stepped forward, his arms full of documents that represented 23 years of careful investigation. He laid them out methodically, the ledgers, the payment records, the mercenary's confession penned in a dying man's shaking hand. "Your Majesty, in 1818, the Dowager Duchess Augusta Sterling embezzled approximately 40,000 florins from imperial accounts to settle gambling debts accrued in Paris and Monte Carlo." Thorne's voice was steady, scholarly, damning. "When Treasury audits began to reveal discrepancies, she orchestrated a scheme to blame Duke Sebastian Aldrich, her own husband, for the missing funds." The room was utterly silent. Even the court stenographer had stopped writing, his pen frozen above the page. "She created false contracts bearing the Duke's signature and seal," Thorne continued. "She then coerced Lord Frederick Vane, the imperial treasurer, to provide testimony supporting her fabrication. The coercion took the form of a direct threat against Lord Vane's 7-year-old daughter, Lady Georgiana." Georgiana felt Arthur's hand find hers beneath the table. She gripped it like a lifeline. "Do you have evidence of this coercion?" von Metternich asked, his tone skeptical. Thorne produced the mercenary's confession, handing it to the Emperor's secretary. "Hans Müller, former soldier and hired blade, confessed on his deathbed to holding a knife to the child's throat while Lord Vane watched. He names the Dowager Duchess as his employer and provides details of the payment, 300 florins, delivered in installments over 6 months. "Lies,"
Augusta said, her voice cutting through the chamber. "The ravings of a dying criminal seeking absolution through false testimony. You have no actual proof." "We have the seals." The Emperor spoke for the first time since the testimony began, his aged fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "Bring the forensic examiner." An elderly man in scholar's robes stepped forward, carrying a wooden case. He opened it to reveal dozens of wax impressions laid out on velvet. "Your Majesty, I have examined every document bearing the Dowager Duchess's personal seal from 1815 to 1820. The seal depicts a raven over 3 stars, a crest granted to her family in 1642. He lifted one impression, holding it to the light. In 1819, the die used to create this seal was damaged, a chip in the raven's left wing. The Dowager had it repaired in 1820, but for approximately 14 months, every seal she made bore this distinctive flaw. Georgiana watched Arthur's face as understanding crystallized. This was the detail that made denial impossible.
The examiner held up the ledger page authorizing payments to the mercenary company. This document, dated November 1818, bears the flawed seal. So do the false contracts attributed to Duke Aldrich. So does the authorization for Lord Vane's coerced testimony. He set them down in a damning row. The seal is authentic. These documents were authorized by the Dowager Duchess herself. Augusta's mask finally cracked. "You don't understand. I was protecting our family. My husband was weak, incompetent." "Silence." The Emperor's voice cut through her justification like a blade. "We have heard enough." He rose slowly, his joints protesting with age, and the entire chamber stood with him. "Dowager Duchess Augusta Sterling, you stand convicted of embezzlement, conspiracy, blackmail, and the destruction of 2 noble houses through deliberate fraud. You perverted imperial justice and corrupted our treasury for personal gain." "Your Majesty, I am the mother of—" "You are nothing." The Emperor's eyes were cold as winter stone. "You have no title, no name, no family. As of this moment, you are stripped of all honors and expelled from our realm. You will be escorted to the Swiss border tonight and forbidden to return on pain of imprisonment. Your estates are forfeit, your accounts are seized, and your name will be stricken from all imperial records." Augusta's face went white. "You cannot." "We have." The Emperor turned to Arthur, and his expression softened slightly. "Duke Sterling, you have our deepest apologies. The crimes committed against your father and your house were unconscionable. Your family's honor is hereby restored. The Aldrich estates wrongfully seized will be returned with interest." Arthur stood, his voice hoarse. "Thank you, Your Majesty. But I must also ask, Lord Frederick Vane, his name, is also restored. Lord Vane acted under duress to protect his child. There is no shame in a father's love." The Emperor's gaze moved to Georgiana. "Lady Georgiana Sterling, now Duchess Duke Sterling, you carry your father's honor without stain. Let no one speak against the Vane name in our presence." Georgiana felt tears slide down her face. Relief, grief, vindication, all tangled together. The guards moved forward to escort Augusta from the chamber. She walked between them with her head high, but Georgiana saw the tremor in her hands, the crack in her perfect posture. As she passed, Augusta's eyes met Arthur's one final time. "I did it for you," she whispered. Arthur looked at her with an expression that held no love, no hate, only an exhausted kind of pity. "No, Mother, you did it for yourself. You always did." Then she was gone, led away to exile and erasure, and the chamber slowly emptied until only Arthur and Georgiana remained. They stood in the empty palace corridor after the chamber had cleared, the weight of vindication somehow heavier than the weight of injustice had been.
Georgiana watched Arthur's face, saw the exhaustion etched in every line, the hollow victory in his eyes. "Your father's name is restored," he said finally. "Your honor, everything I tried to destroy. And your father's name as well, your family's fortune. At the cost of learning my mother was a monster." Arthur's laugh was bitter. "Some trade." Georgiana reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We survived. That's more than I thought possible 3 weeks ago." He looked down at their joined hands, and something shifted in his expression, the hard edges softening, the walls he'd built so carefully beginning to crumble. "I burned your veil. I froze you in empty rooms. I humiliated you before the entire Viennese court." His voice cracked. "How can you even stand to touch me?" "Because I saw you at my bedside when the fever took me. I heard you reading to me in the darkness, holding my hand like you were afraid I'd slip away." She stepped closer, her free hand rising to touch his face. "I saw the boy who helped me retrieve a ribbon. He's still there, Arthur, buried under all that rage and pain, but still there." "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Perhaps not, but you have it anyway." Georgiana's thumb traced the line of his jaw. "We were both victims of your mother's manipulations. We both lost parents to her schemes. We can choose to let that define us, or we can choose something else." "What else is there?" "A beginning, a real one this time." She took a shaky breath. "We're married, Arthur, legally bound until death. We can make that a prison, or we can make it something worth surviving for." He pulled her against him suddenly, his arms wrapping around her with desperate strength. She felt him shaking, felt wetness against her hair that might have been tears. "I don't know how to not hate," he whispered. "I've built my entire life around it for so long." "Then learn. We'll learn together." Georgiana held him just as tightly. "Love isn't something we're owed or something we deserve. It's something we choose every day, every moment." They stood like that for a long time, two broken people holding each other in an empty corridor, until Arthur finally pulled back enough to look at her face. "Marry me again," he said. "We're already married." "I know, but that wedding was a weapon, a public execution." His hands framed her face with infinite gentleness. "I want to marry you properly, privately, just us and a priest, and vows that mean something true. No court watching, no politics, just us." Georgiana felt her heart crack open. Yes. 3 days later, they stood together in a small chapel on the grounds of the Stirling estate in Lower Austria, the one that had belonged to her family before they lost everything. Arthur had bought it back, had it restored, and filled it with white roses, her mother's favorite flower. The priest was elderly and kind, asking no questions about why a duke and duchess needed to marry again. Greta stood as witness, tears streaming down her face. No one else was there. No emperor, no court, no whispers or judgment. Georgiana wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her hair loose around her shoulders. No veil this time, no cameo brooch heavy with family history. Just herself, standing before a man who had tried to destroy her and instead had learned to love her. Arthur's hands trembled as he took hers. "I, Arthur Edmund Stirling, take you, Georgiana Elizabeth Vane, as my wife, not as payment for a debt or a weapon for revenge, but as my partner, my equal, my chance at redemption." His voice broke. "I was wrong about everything except this. You are extraordinary, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." Georgiana's tears fell freely now. I, Georgiana Elizabeth Vane, take you, Arthur Edmund Sterling, as my husband, not because I must, but because I choose to, because I saw who you were beneath the anger, because you stayed by my bedside when I was dying, because love is stronger than hate, and mercy is stronger than revenge. The priest blessed them, but they barely heard the words. They were already kissing, Arthur's hands in her hair, Georgiana's arms around his, both of them laughing and crying at once. When they finally pulled apart, Arthur pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a veil to burn this time." "Good. I prefer this version anyway." He laughed, a real laugh, free of bitterness. "Come home with me, to our home. I had fires lit in every room. I had your chambers moved to be next to mine. He paused, suddenly uncertain. "If you want, if you're ready." "I'm ready." Georgiana kissed him again, soft and sure. "Take me home, husband." They left the chapel hand in hand, walking through winter sunshine toward a carriage that would carry them not to separate wings and cold rooms, but to a shared future built on truth instead of lies. Behind them, Greta gathered the white roses to save and press between pages, proof that even the most broken things could bloom again. The Vienna newspapers would talk for weeks about the Dowager's exile and the restoration of two noble houses. But in a small chapel in Lower Austria, two people who had been enemies learned to be lovers and chose each day to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Love over revenge, truth over comfortable lies, beginning over ending. It was enough. It was everything. Our time together is ending, but the scandal doesn't have to. If your heart is still racing, don't let it die here. The two stories on your screen are darker, deeper, and even more irresistible. Subscribe so we don't lose each other, then click one now. Your next obsession is waiting.